I think part of it is I have made so many, God, I've made so many mistakes from the time I was released because I got in my mind, you know, call it 6 months before I was being released. I was well deep into a handful of things that I had already been writing. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm coming out, I'm getting published, screenplays getting made, the whole 9 yards. And that's all well and good until you understand that there's an actual business and a process behind it. And I'll never forget it. Literally, the first person I connected with on Twitter was she may kill me for this. Was I believe it's Rachel Rokicki from Penguin, because I knew she worked with, I guess, Sarah Jessica Parker's imprint over there, and the genesis of my initial novel was something from an interview I saw with Sarah Jessica Parker, which is as random as it gets. And, like a complete ass, I immediately connected. She's #1 connection on my Twitter, and then immediately assaulting her with DMs or emails or whatever. And oddly, they all went unrecognized and unnoticed. And, I didn't understand the query process. I didn't understand the idea of an agent, absolutely none of that. And if it wasn't for some really dear friends that I made through Twitter, that just really, the whole writing community is unbelievably embracing and welcoming, especially for a jackass like me who's just coming in and hey, all right, so I'm here I am, what do I do? And luckily enough, as I went through the process, some people found some of my work relatively compelling, and I submitted my manuscript to a handful of queries here and there, and it wasn't until about the 10th or 15th rejection I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I showed somebody my query letter, and they're like, what are you, a psychopath? And I was like, well, I've got some issues, but I don't know what I'm doing. And they cleaned it up, and oddly enough, my agent actually saw one of my short stories through something else, and through another author in her stable had said, listen, you should really chat with him. He's writing some really interesting stuff. He's got a unique voice. And honestly, from our first call, I was in love with her on the first call. And it's funny because I was far down the line with a couple of other agents that I really liked and respected, but we just weren't the right match. And it was, I guess in hindsight, I was really lucky knowing that it wasn't the right match. And it's very hard walking away from one, but when they want you to sort of change, hey, we love your novel, but we'd like it if you change the lead characters from this to this. And I get it from a mercenary marketing standpoint, and I understand that aspect of it, but it just would have felt very disingenuous for me to change and write about something that I'm probably firsthand not well versed in, I think is maybe the politically correct way of saying it. It just wouldn't have been right. And whereas with my agent Max from Maximus Literary, I mean, she and her whole team just from day one, they got it, they got the voice, the person, and honestly, the personalities, you want to have that relationship where the personalities really match really well with the same dark sense of humor. It's just a great fit. And, and it's one of those things where I have no idea where it goes. I have no idea if the books get published, if the movies get made, any of that happens. I'm just so enjoying this ride. If you would have asked me, a little over a year ago when I first got out, if I would be where I'm at now, never would have imagined it. And it's great. It really, just the friendships I've made alone through it is really a wonderful thing. It's beyond being persistent. You have to do your homework, right? You need to be able to recognize who you are as a writer. And I don't want to like, I'm the last person in the world to be like, well, let me talk about craft, because I'm not that guy. But what I can say is you need to know who you are as a writer, and what your audience is that you're appealing to, and then try to find the agents where that's going to be a fit, right? You can't worry about what's going to sell now and what's going to be interesting, and who's like the best agent to go to. You have to find somebody who will get who you are and can make you a better writer. Like somebody where you can submit something to, and they'll say, listen, this is great, however, here's why it sucks and here's how we're going to fix it. And you just have to leave ego at the door and recognize that when all is said and done, it's in everyone's interest. You're on a team, and it's in everyone's best interest for you to succeed. It's funny. I got into a whole big debate about this recently that started off going sideways, but actually kind of turned out really well in the end, about the whole idea of like transgressive literature. I love Bret Easton Ellis, Chuck Palahniuk. I would be absolutely remiss not to say I hadn't been influenced by Hemingway to some degree. And it's tough because for some people they get it comes across as like this is bro literature, and I look at transgressive fiction a different way, as just being a portrayal of what you know and what you're around and what forms you, right? So it would be ridiculous for me to write about things that I can't understand, or write in a manner that just doesn't fit, versus a sort of gritty realism based on, even if it's fictional, you're always going to have a part of you in those works. And, listen, rightly or wrongly, I've experienced a thing or two, and it just naturally creeps into it. And, I don't want to write thinking, if I started writing like some sort of fantasy worlds with unicorns and magical elves and God knows what, people are like, just get the hell out of here, dude. What are you doing? And because they know me enough to know that that's not me. So it just, I think there's a certain voyeuristic tendency for people who want to see things, who want to see not necessarily the seedier side of life, but just sort of like, there but the grace of God go I type approach. And, having it come from an authentic voice. And I think that's, what is the appeal when all's said and done. It's really funny because the bulk of my work typically tends to walk on sort of the grittier, darker side. It's just an area I'm comfortable with. It's an area, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm quite familiar with. But then the funny thing is, like, I have a column that I write for a magazine in Texas, and it's one of these, it's a great magazine, Austin Waterways. It's sort of like the high-end luxury lifestyle living, for Texas. And like every story there, I'm cautioned, always has to be like kind of a Hallmark Channel-esque type. So they're all like meet cute stories and misconnections and all that fun stuff. And it's funny because I've had people read this and they're like, if that's the first thing of mine they read, they have no idea. And it may have happened to a friend of the family who read one or two of the stories from the magazine as they're going through my website, and then they like read something else about getting your neck broken in an illegal massage parlor, and they're just like, I had no idea what I was reading, So I know where my heart lay when it comes to the stuff I write and that I'm most comfortable with. And like I said, it's the experience that kind of formulates you, and whether it's from a familial experience, I'm forever working out unresolved issues with my father in my works, for sure. I'm forever trying to work out my issues, trying to make sure I'm a good father to my son. If he could hear me right now, he would absolutely be yelling his head off saying, work harder. It is what it is. But, I think honestly, I think one of the truest things I ever read, and I hate to be cliched and keep bringing up Hemingway, but one of his quotes was, "Start with the truest sentence and then write from there." Some sort of bastardized version of that. And he's right. It's just easier to sit and write about something that you know and can reference because it comes across authentic. The moment something doesn't, as a reader, and now that I'm reading for the Adirondack Review, if something just doesn't come across authentic, it's very hard to suspend belief in certain respects. And when you can read something and you go, wow, you really feel like you're drawn in, and the tale is being told well, that's a great story for me. It's bad to be at this point in life when you hit 50 and you're like, you know what, I would still like to scrap a little bit, because I've witnessed my father fight at a significantly older age than this, and just having no fear, and again, in the realm of like shaping you, but that's neither here nor there. But you feel like you kind of want to, like, I mean, I think there was even a movie called Wrestling Hemingway, if I recall correctly. Like, but somebody who's sort of the quote unquote consummate man's man. You just, I would love to have a subtle disagreement with him, perhaps at a bar somewhere, and see where it went. And believe me, I'll tell you, there's a few women on Twitter who I'd love to scrap with, because I think they would absolutely kick my ass. But I mean, that's the writing community, right? I mean, everyone's driven by something, has that little bit of a demon and that little bit of an edge. And man, any given day, oh boy, that would be, yeah. But I wouldn't mind the little infraction with Mr. Hemingway, perhaps. Like, I'm really happy. Like, it's and it's funny because I engage with a lot of writers on Twitter, and I love the fact, like, some of my I mean, it's funny because I actually think of these people as being real friends, even though it's not quote unquote real life, because we don't engage. But every once in a while we'll Zoom and catch up. But you get a certain affection for certain people, and it's exciting when you see something, a piece that gets accepted, for yourself or for a friend or whatever it may be. But I've got a spreadsheet, and I can show you pictures. It looks like a crime scene because I code things in, green for what's been accepted, red for what's been denied, and yellow for stuff that's pending. And it honestly, like, it looks like a crime scene with the amount of red on there and the number of times, like, pieces will get rejected. And early on, I think the worst thing that can happen is, like, when you submit your first piece and it gets accepted right out of the gate, and people are like, wow, this is really great. You have really great talent. Then you naturally assume, wow, I really am talented, and every piece should be accepted, until you submit your next, X number of pieces, and you're like, what the hell happened? And now all of a sudden, I'm aha, and I'm a one-hit wonder, and I've already given in my take on me, and that's it. And that's a reference that, unfortunately, 80 to 90% of the viewers who see this will probably not get because of the age. But nevertheless, you can't take it personally, and I know I'm friends with so many editors, and we all joke about the idea of, like, everything is subjective, and what doesn't fit here will fit somewhere else. And the reality is it's true. Like, some things work better in some places or than others, and sometimes the piece just isn't good, or it's not ready yet. And the problem is, you get so enamored with a certain piece, and it doesn't matter how many times you've edited it, you'll get to a point where you can't do anything more with it, and you can't understand why it doesn't work. And if I give one piece of advice, it's absolutely, there are a handful of literary magazines I absolutely love. Obviously, Purple Wall is one of them. You guys are great. You guys published literally one of my first stories out there. But there are magazines that, you can pay X amount to submit and get feedback on a piece. And I will absolutely say, if you have a piece you've been working on and you're struggling with it, pay for the editing, like pay for them to give you feedback so you can go, oh damn, I didn't see this, I didn't know this, whatever it is, because the number of times I've submitted a piece that's been rejected by multiple places and then have given it to an editor, and now that I have, God bless it, now that I've got the luxury of an agency that I can say, hey, can y'all take a quick look at this and tell me um, where I'm going sideways, and having somebody else come back and clear it up, and then it gets printed somewhere else. I mean, I've had plenty of pieces that have been rejected outright that have now been nominated for like a Best of the Net or a push card or something, because I needed that tweak or whatever it was to fix it. And that to me is like, that's why the writing community is great, right? I mean, it's a terrible thing, like when you send stuff to, friends or family, and you have these sycophants who are just like, oh my God, you're amazing, you're an amazing writer. And listen, I'm happy to stroke my ego all day long. I will never get tired of somebody saying I'm an amazing writer. But I also recognize it's a lot of shite, for more lack of a better word, half the time. And the number of pieces I have that are sitting on the sideline like orphan kids that I'm going, I'm sorry, I just like this kid better, and it just worked. A lot of it is trial and error, but you need somebody who will be honest with you and kind of keep you in check and say, hey, here's why it's good, but, and that makes all the difference in the world. It's such a silly thing to say. When I finished the first draft of, what's quote unquote my first novel, I bawled. I bawled like a little kid, because it was just such a release. I have no idea. Like, it's like I said, I'm just so thrilled and humbled to have gotten to this point where, like, I mean, it's such an obnoxious thing to say, to be like, well, I talked to my agent yesterday, and like, I drop that every chance I can. I'm on the checkout line in the supermarket, and I'm like, well, my agent said I should be drinking whole milk, and they just look at me like I'm a jackass. And it just makes me so happy, like getting to this point when I have having one of my pieces in your guys' anthology last year, and then literally getting a copy of the book and parading it around. Like, man, it's an amazing feeling. Mostly because it's obviously it's having the acknowledgement from someone else is wonderful. But man, if my pilot, good Lord, if my pilot gets made, if my book gets published, I am going to make sure there's no cameras around in the celebration mode. But yeah, I definitely have some issues to work out, and I will have plenty of bourbon and pie to celebrate with, for sure. I will not lie. I am an absolute fan of my bourbons. And I will say, much it's like indie writers. I love the independent distillers. I the guys down at Burnt Church Distillery in Bluffton, South Carolina, just from the hospitality alone, they were just great people. Love them. Love the folks at Iron Smoke up in Rochester, New York, of all places, making just some really good stuff. There's no shortage of them. And, I will say, not that a small, the little nip bottles of Jameson's made their way in during my adult timeout for St. Patrick's Day. But there's a definite affection for that, for its own right. Cigars couldn't have been done, but it's all good. I'll tell you, I mean, there's something I do make it a point of having a quote unquote victory cigar when I finish a piece, or, some sort of monumental edit or whatever it may be. I love technically I don't smoke them because they're illegal here, but the Partagas Series D's, delightful, out of Havana. And the Drew Estates The Acid 20-year anniversary cigar, probably one of my favorites. And same with anything they make out of Liga Privada. You pair that up with just about any bourbon, and I am a very happy camper, to say the least. I'm so incredibly thankful for the writing community, like on Twitter. And I mean, you guys are great. Every chance I can, I try to pump you guys up out there and get more people following you. There's so much good short. I love flash fiction. There's so many good short stories that are out there. And it's funny because people are like, when they hear like, oh, you're a writer, what are you reading these days? And I'll rattle off like a half a dozen, like, Wilson K. Wing or Ash Leto, or, I mean, like there's so many people that I just love and I follow, and Aaron Birch and you name it, that are putting out really cool short stories, and people just look at you like, they have no idea what you're talking about. But it's for anybody who's writing or thinking of writing, like just put yourself out there and embrace people, because they are so wonderfully welcoming. I am so incredibly humbled that I could literally be a guy who, got out of prison and a month later is kind of noodling around on Twitter and trying to, make friends or whatever, and peddle stories here and there, and having people be like, dude, yeah, come on, that's great. And the number of times I was able to put stuff out there and without people questioning. And it's funny how like months later, people will be like, hey, I meant to ask you, what'd you do? What happened? And it's, people just are very incredibly respectful, which is something you never hear about on Twitter, but you can make tremendous friends and really help grow what you're doing as a writer. And there's no way I would have been able to do it without these kind of connections. So I think it's a wonderful thing. So never be afraid to put yourself out there, and just be true to the writer you are, I think is the best thing I could say.